The dust rose like a specter as the wagon train pulled away, abandoning Florence Keller to her fate in the small, weather-beaten cabin that had served as a waystation for the journey west. At 22, she had never imagined being left behind, but the typhoid fever that ravaged her body had made her a liability to the settlers pushing toward California's promise of gold and new beginnings. Blake Garrison watched from the doorway of the waystation, his hat clutched in his calloused hands, jaw set firm as the last wagon disappeared over the horizon. The year was 1853, and the California Trail was unforgiving to those who couldn't keep pace. As the designated scout for the wagon train, he should have continued with them, but something about leaving the young woman alone to die had struck him as unconscionably wrong. "They're gone," he said, turning back to where Florence lay on the crude cot, her skin glistening with sweat, golden hair plastered to her forehead. "But I ain't." Florence's eyes fluttered open, glassy with fever. "You'll die too," she whispered, her voice so fragile it nearly shattered against the rough-hewn walls. "The fever takes everyone in the end." Blake shook his head, placing his hat on the small table beside her bed. "Not everyone," he said firmly. "My ma was a healer back in Missouri. Taught me a thing or two before consumption took her. I've seen this fever before, and I've seen people walk away from it." "Why?" Florence asked, struggling to focus on his face. "Why would you stay? You don't even know me." A cough racked her body, and Blake gently wiped her forehead with a damp cloth. "Maybe I want to," he replied simply. "Rest now, save your strength. We got a long fight ahead." Outside, the vast expanse of the prairie stretched toward the distant mountains. They were about a week's ride from Lone Pine, California, where the wagon train was headed. The small way station had been built by previous travelers, a single room with a stone fireplace, abandoned supplies, and mercifully, a well that still drew clean water. Blake moved with purpose, gathering the wild herbs he recognized from his mother's teachings. Willow bark for the fever, yarrow for the sweating, and whatever else he could find that might help. The sun beat down mercilessly as he worked, aware that Florence's survival rested largely on his shoulders now. When he returned, she was sleeping fitfully, murmuring words he couldn't understand. Blake set to work, brewing the bitter tea his mother had sworn by, coaxing Florence to drink whenever she was lucid enough to swallow. As darkness fell across the prairie, he lit a lamp and settled in for the night, determined that she wouldn't face the darkness alone. "My family," Florence whispered in the night, startling Blake from his half-sleep in the chair beside her. "They were counting on me." "Your family on the wagons?" he asked, reaching for the water. She shook her head weakly. "Dead, all dead back in Ohio, cholera. Was going to my aunt in Sacramento, starting over." Her words slurred with exhaustion and fever. "The Millers took me in, now they're gone too." Blake's throat tightened, so she was alone in the world just as he was. "Well," he said finally, "seems to me you've still got someone." The next 3 days passed in a blur of fevers, chills, and desperate moments when Blake feared he'd made a fatal mistake in staying. Florence's condition worsened before it improved, her breathing becoming so shallow at times that he placed his hand over her heart just to be certain it still beat. On the 4th night, as a thunderstorm raged across the plains, her fever broke. Blake woke to find her watching him, her eyes clear for the first time since he'd stayed behind. "You're still here," she said, wonder in her voice. Blake nodded, relief washing through him. "Told you I would be." "I dreamed you were an angel," Florence said softly, "sent to take me to heaven." "No angel, madam," he replied with a half-smile, "just a stubborn cowboy who doesn't much like seeing folks left behind." Florence studied him in the soft lamplight, taking in his features properly for the first time. Blake Garrison was perhaps 30, with sun-weathered skin and eyes the color of a summer storm. His dark hair curled slightly at the collar of his faded shirt, and several days' growth of beard shadowed his jawline. "Why did you really stay?" she asked. Blake considered the question, looking down at his hands. "Lost my wife and baby boy to this same fever 3 years back. Wasn't there when it happened, was out on a cattle drive. By the time I got home, they were already in the ground." He looked up, meeting her gaze. "Couldn't watch it happen again, not if I could help. Florence reached out a trembling hand and he took it gently in his own. "Thank you," she whispered. As dawn broke, painting the sky in delicate pinks and golds, Florence managed to sit up for the first time. Blake brought her a small portion of the stew he'd made from jerky and the few potatoes left in the waystation stores. "We'll need to think about moving on soon," he said as she ate. "Provisions won't last forever here," Florence nodded. "To Lone Pine to catch up with the others," Blake hesitated. "That would be the sensible thing. But they've got at least a week's head start and you're in no condition to travel hard." He paused. "There's a small settlement about 3 days' ride south of here. Might be easier on you." "Do you know people there?" she asked. "No," he admitted, "but I know of it. Trading post a few homesteads. Might be work for both of us until you're strong enough to continue on." Florence set down her bowl, her hands still unsteady. "Both of us? You'd stay with me even after we reach the settlement?" Blake looked away, suddenly self-conscious. "Unless you'd rather I didn't." "No," she said quickly. "I mean, yes, I'd like that. I don't have anyone else." The simple admission hung in the air between them, a truth they both recognized in each other, the loneliness of being untethered in a vast and often cruel world. Over the next 3 days, Florence's strength gradually returned. Blake fashioned a walking stick from a sturdy branch, and each day she ventured a little farther from the cabin, rebuilding her strength. He watched her move in the sunlight, her golden hair catching the rays, and felt something stir in his chest that he thought had died with Sarah. "Tell me about your life before," Florence said one evening as they sat outside the cabin, watching the sunset paint the prairie in fire. "Before you joined the wagon train." Blake stretched his long legs before him, considering. "Not much to tell. Grew up in Missouri, learned to break horses when I was 14, married my sweetheart at 19, had our boy a year later." His voice softened. "After they passed, I couldn't stand the silence of our homestead. Sold everything except what would fit in my saddlebags and headed west. Been drifting ever since, taking work where I can find it." "And now you're heading to California," he nodded. "Figured I'd try my hand at something new. Maybe find some land, start over." He glanced at her. "What about you? What were your plans once you reached your aunt's?" Florence tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. "I was going to help in her boarding house. She wrote that Sacramento is growing fast with all the gold seekers coming through. Said a respectable young woman could find a husband easily." She smiled wryly. "Though I suppose arriving half dead from typhoid might dampen my prospects somewhat." Blake laughed, a sound that surprised them both. "I don't know about that. Proves you're a fighter, doesn't it?" Their eyes met, and something passed between them, a recognition, perhaps, of kindred spirits. The next morning, Blake saddled his horse, a sturdy dun gelding named Maverick, and prepared the small cart he'd found behind the waystation. He'd cleaned it, repaired a broken wheel, and padded it with blankets to make Florence as comfortable as possible for their journey. "It ain't elegant," he apologized as he helped her into the cart, "but it'll get us where we need to go." Florence settled against the blankets. "After thinking I'd die in that cabin, this feels like a royal carriage." They set out under a clear blue sky, Blake leading Maverick at a gentle pace, mindful of Florence's still fragile condition. The prairie stretched around them, vast and beautiful in its emptiness, dotted with wildflowers that swayed in the gentle breeze. That night, Blake made camp beside a small creek, helping Florence from the cart and setting up a simple fire. They shared the last of the waystation's provisions, and Blake promised to hunt the next day. "I never properly thanked you," Florence said as they sat beside the fire, "for staying, for saving my life." Blake poked at the embers with a stick. "No thanks needed. Anyone would have done the same." "No," she said firmly, "they wouldn't. The Millers didn't. No one else from the wagon train volunteered to stay behind, just you." She reached across the space between them, touching his arm lightly. "So thank you, Blake Garrison." The warmth of her touch lingered long after she'd withdrawn her hand. Their journey continued for 2 more days, traveling slowly but steadily southward. Blake managed to shoot a rabbit, providing them with fresh meat, and they gathered berries and edible plants along the way. Florence grew stronger each day, even insisting on walking beside the cart for short stretches to regain her strength. They talked of many things during those days: childhood memories, favorite books, hopes for the future. Blake found himself laughing more than he had in years, drawn to Florence's quiet wit and resilience. In turn, she discovered the gentleness that lay beneath his weathered exterior, the way he always made sure she had the softer blanket, the larger portion of food. On the afternoon of the third day, they crested a small rise and saw the settlement in the distance, a collection of perhaps 15 buildings nestled in a small valley. "Silver Creek," Blake announced. "Not much, but it'll do for now." Florence nodded, a strange mixture of relief and regret filling her. Their time alone together was coming to an end, and she found herself wishing they could have stretched the journey a little longer. The settlement welcomed them cautiously. Strangers were always regarded with suspicion in the frontier, especially a man traveling alone with a woman who was clearly recovering from illness. Blake explained their situation to the proprietor of the small trading post, a gruff man named Hiram Porter. "Typhoid, you say?" Porter eyed Florence warily. "She ain't contagious no more." "No, sir," Blake assured him. "Fever broke over a week ago. She's on the mend." Porter scratched his beard thoughtfully. "Well, I could use some help around the store. Wife's been complaining she can't keep up with everything since our daughter got married and moved on." He glanced at Florence. "Girl looks like she could use a proper bed and some good meals. You any good with figures, miss?" Florence straightened. "Yes, sir. I kept the books for my father's hardware store back in Ohio." "Good enough." Porter nodded. "There's a room above the store you can have. As for you," he turned to Blake, "Jacob Fisher over at the livery was just saying yesterday he needs a man who knows horses." Just like that, they had found a temporary sanctuary. The room above Porter's trading post was small but clean, with a narrow bed, a chair, and a window that looked out onto the settlement's single street. Florence stood in the middle of it, overwhelmed by the sudden turn in her fortunes. "It's not much," Blake said from the doorway, "but it'll do until you're stronger." "Where will you stay?" she asked. "Fisher said I can bunk in the tack room at the livery," he replied. "I've slept in worse places." An awkward silence fell between them, the intimacy of their shared journey suddenly giving way to the reality of their new surroundings. "I'll check on you tomorrow," Blake said finally. "Make sure you're settling in all right." As he turned to leave, Florence called after him. "Blake." When he turned back, she said simply, "Thank you for everything." He tipped his hat with a small smile and was gone. The days in Silver Creek fell into a rhythm. Florence worked in Porter's store, keeping the ledgers and helping customers, growing stronger with each passing day. Blake spent his days at the livery, working with horses and making himself useful around the settlement. They saw each other often. The town was too small for it to be otherwise, sharing meals at the small cafe run by a widow named Martha Reed, or walking together in the evenings when their work was done. A month passed, and Florence flourished under Mrs. Porter's motherly care. Her cheeks filled out, her hair regained its luster, and her laugh came more easily. Blake watched the transformation with a mixture of pride and growing affection that he tried, unsuccessfully, to temper. One evening in late summer, they walked to the creek that gave the settlement its name, sitting on its banks as the sun began its descent. "I received a letter today," Florence said, trailing her fingers in the cool water. "From my aunt in Sacramento." Blake felt a sudden tightness in his chest. "Oh," she says, "I'm still welcome whenever I'm able to make the journey." Florence didn't look at him, keeping her gaze on the rippling water. "She says there's plenty of opportunity there for a young woman." "That's good news," Blake said carefully, though it felt like anything but. "When do you think you'll go?" Florence was quiet for a long moment. "I'm not sure that I will," he looked at her sharply. "What do you mean?" she shrugged, finally meeting his gaze. "I've been thinking, Silver Creek isn't so bad, the Porters have been kind, I'm useful here." She hesitated. "And there are other reasons to stay." Blake's heart hammered in his chest. "What reasons?" Instead of answering, Florence leaned forward and pressed her lips gently to his. It was a brief kiss, chaste and questioning, but it sent a jolt through Blake that left him breathless. When she pulled away, her cheeks were flushed. "That's one reason," she whispered. Blake stared at her for a long moment, scarcely believing what had just happened. Then, slowly, he reached out to cup her face in his hands. "Florence," he said softly, "I never expected. After Sarah, I didn't think I could feel this way again." "Neither did I," she admitted. After losing everyone, I'd built walls around my heart, but then you stayed when everyone else left. You fought for me when you barely knew me." Blake brushed a strand of hair from her face. "Best decision I ever made." This time when they kissed, it was deeper, a promise of something neither had dared hope for again, a future shared, rather than faced alone. The news of their courtship spread quickly through Silver Creek, met with knowing smiles and approving nods. The Porters, who had come to think of Florence almost as a daughter, were particularly pleased. "About time," Mrs. Porter said one morning as she helped Florence prepare the store for opening. "That man's been sweet on you since the moment you two rode into town." Florence blushed. "We've both lost so much, it's frightening to risk loving again." Mrs. Porter patted her hand. "That's precisely why you should, my dear. Life's too short and too hard out here to deny yourself happiness when you find it." In the evenings, Blake would come to the Porters' home for supper, and afterward he and Florence would sit on the porch, talking of their pasts and cautiously laying plans for a future together. He spoke of his dream to have a small ranch someday, a place to put down roots after years of drifting. "Would you want that kind of life?" he asked her one evening as they watched the stars emerge. "It's a hard one for a woman," Florence smiled. "After surviving typhoid in a waystation in the middle of nowhere, I think I can handle a ranch." She leaned her head against his shoulder. "Besides, I wouldn't be alone." As autumn painted the surrounding countryside in gold and crimson, Blake saved every penny from his work at the livery, and Florence did the same with her wages from the store. Together, they began to look for a small piece of land where they could start their life together. It was Jacob Fisher who brought news of a possibility. "Old Man Richardson's place," he told Blake one afternoon as they worked, "about 5 miles west of town. He passed last winter and his nephew back east is looking to sell. It's not much, small cabin, maybe 40 acres, some of it wooded, but the price is fair." Blake's pulse quickened. "You think he'd consider an offer?" Fisher nodded. "I can write to him if you're interested." Richardson kept the place up decent enough. Good water source, some cleared land for grazing. That evening, Blake could barely contain his excitement as he shared the news with Florence. They sat at their usual table in Martha's cafe, heads bent close together. "It sounds perfect," Florence said, her eyes shining. "When can we see it?" Fisher said he'd take us out there tomorrow if you can get away from the store. Mrs. Porter was more than happy to give Florence the day off when she heard the reason. "Land of your own," she said, clapping her hands. "That's how a proper life begins out here." The Richardson place was everything Fisher had described and more. The cabin was small but solidly built, with a stone fireplace and 2 rooms. A creek ran along the northern edge of the property, and the land rolled gently, with enough flat areas for crops and grazing. Florence walked from room to room in the cabin, already envisioning where furniture would go, how she would make this place a home. Outside, Blake stood with Fisher, discussing fencing and the condition of the small barn. "What do you think?" Blake asked when they were alone, Fisher having walked down to check on the creek. Florence turned in a slow circle, taking in the rough-hewn walls, the simple plank flooring, the windows that let in streams of autumn sunlight. "I think," she said softly, "that this is where we're meant to be." Blake crossed to her, taking her hands in his. "Then I reckon we should make Fisher an offer." Their offer was accepted within a week, and preparations for their wedding began in earnest. The entire settlement embraced the celebration, the first wedding in Silver Creek in nearly 2 years. Mrs. Porter insisted on making Florence's dress, while Hiram Porter offered to give the bride away. Martha Reed promised to bake a proper wedding cake, a luxury rarely seen on the frontier. The ceremony took place on a crisp October day, with the leaves of the cottonwoods along the creek a brilliant gold. The small church in Silver Creek was filled to capacity as Florence walked down the aisle to where Blake waited, his eyes never leaving her face. "You look beautiful," he whispered as she reached him, taking her hands in his. The minister, a circuit preacher who happened to be passing through, smiled at the gathered congregation. "Dearly beloved," he began, "we are gathered here today to witness the joining of Blake Garrison and Florence Keller in holy matrimony." The words of the ceremony washed over Florence like a dream. She had traveled so far, lost so much, nearly died alone in that way station. And yet here she stood, about to begin a new life with a man who had risked everything to save her. "I, Blake, take thee, Florence, to be my wedded wife." Blake's voice was steady, his eyes locked with hers. "To have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do us part." When it came time for her vows, Florence's voice trembled slightly, but her words rang clear. "I, Florence, take thee, Blake, to be my wedded husband. To have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do us part." "By the power vested in me," the preacher said, "I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss your bride." Blake's kiss was gentle and reverent, sealing their vows before the witnesses who had become their new community. The celebration afterward was joyous, with music provided by a fiddler from a neighboring farm and tables laden with food contributed by everyone in the settlement. Blake and Florence danced under the stars, surrounded by well-wishers who had come to care for them in the short time they'd been in Silver Creek. "Happy?" Blake asked as they swayed together, his arm secure around her waist. Florence looked up at him, at this man who had become her whole world. "More than I ever thought possible," she replied. That night they stayed in their new cabin for the first time, the interior hastily prepared for their wedding night by the women of Silver Creek, who had brought fresh linens, candles, and small touches to make the space welcoming. A fire crackled in the fireplace, casting a warm glow over the simple furnishings. Blake carried Florence across the threshold, setting her gently on her feet in what was now their home. "Mrs. Garrison," he said softly, the name still new on his tongue. "I like the sound of that," she replied, reaching up to loosen his tie. Their coming together was tender and unhurried, a discovery of each other that left them both breathless and wondering at the miracle of finding such love after so much loss. The first year on their small ranch was filled with hard work and quiet joy. Blake purchased a few head of cattle and 2 sturdy draft horses for plowing. They planted a vegetable garden, and Florence started a small flock of chickens. With each passing month, the cabin became more of a home. Curtains at the windows, a quilt on their bed, shelves that Blake built to hold Florence's few treasured books. They rode into Silver Creek often, maintaining their friendships and purchasing supplies. Blake continued to help at the livery when extra hands were needed, and Florence still assisted Mrs. Porter with the store's books once a month. The settlement had become their extended family, people who had embraced them when they had no one else. Spring brought new life to their land, calves in the small herd, seedlings pushing through the soil in the garden. And with it came news that brought both joy and trepidation. "I'm with child," Florence told Blake one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the western sky. She took his hand and placed it on her still flat stomach. Due in the fall, Mrs. Porter thinks. Blake's expression transformed from shock to wonder to absolute joy in the space of heartbeats. "A baby," he whispered, as if saying it too loudly might make it disappear. "Our baby." Florence saw the shadow that crossed his face, knew he was remembering the son he had lost, the grief that had sent him wandering westward. She placed her hand over his. "This child will know so much love," she promised. Blake nodded, pulling her close. "Yes," he agreed, "so much love." The months of Florence's pregnancy passed with a mixture of anticipation and hard work. Blake insisted on taking on more of the physical labor, despite Florence's protests that she wasn't an invalid. He built a cradle from pine wood, sanding it smooth and painting it with a pale blue wash. Florence sewed tiny garments in the evenings, quilted a blanket from scraps of fabric given by the women of Silver Creek. Summer faded into autumn, and Florence's time grew near. Blake rode into town to fetch Mrs. Porter, who had delivered countless babies over the years, and Martha Reed, who would help with the household while Florence recovered. The labor began as the first snow of the season dusted the ground, a gentle reminder of winter's approach. Florence labored through the night, Blake pacing outside the bedroom door, his face etched with worry as he heard his wife's cries. "You'll wear a path in that floor, son," Martha said kindly, bringing him a cup of coffee. She's strong, your Florence, and Mrs. Porter knows what she's doing. Just as dawn broke, a new cry filled the cabin, the lusty wail of a newborn taking its first breath. Blake froze, his heart hammering against his ribs. The bedroom door opened and Mrs. Porter appeared, her face tired but beaming. "You have a son, Mr. Garrison, a fine, healthy boy. And your wife is doing well." Blake entered the bedroom on unsteady legs, his eyes immediately finding Florence propped against the pillows, her hair damp with sweat but her face radiant as she cradled a small bundle against her breast. "Come meet your son," she said softly. Blake sat carefully on the edge of the bed, peering at the tiny face nestled in the blanket. The baby had a shock of dark hair like his, but Florence's delicate features. As he watched, the infant opened his eyes dark blue, as all newborns were, and seemed to look directly at him. "He's perfect," Blake whispered, reaching out to touch one tiny fist, marveling as the small fingers curled around his own. "What shall we name him?" Florence had given this much thought. "I was thinking we might call him Thomas, after your father, Thomas William Garrison." Blake's throat tightened with emotion. "Thomas," he repeated, "I think that suits him just fine." Life with a newborn brought new challenges and immeasurable joy to the small ranch. Blake found himself rising in the night to bring the baby to Florence for feedings, watching in wonder as his son grew stronger each day. Thomas had his father's dark hair and his mother's curious nature, his eyes eventually settling into a deep brown that reminded Florence of Blake's. Winter passed in a peaceful cocoon, the three of them snug in their cabin as snow blanketed the land. Blake read aloud in the evenings from Florence's books, his deep voice lulling both wife and child to sleep beside the fire. When spring arrived, bringing with it the first anniversary of their wedding, they rode into Silver Creek for a celebration at the Porters'. Thomas, now 6 months old, was passed from one admiring arm to another, the object of much cooing and praise. "You've built a good life," Hiram Porter said to Blake as they watched Florence showing the baby to Mrs. Porter and Martha. "From strangers in trouble to a proper family in just a year, that's something to be proud of." Blake nodded, his chest tight with gratitude for how far they had come. "I never expected any of this when I stayed behind with her at that waystation, just couldn't bear the thought of her dying alone." "Sometimes the best things in life come from the hardest decisions," Porter replied. "You took a risk and look what you gained." The years flowed by, marked by the seasons and the milestones of their growing family. Thomas was joined 2 years later by a sister, Elizabeth Sarah, named for both grandmothers the children would never know. The small ranch prospered under Blake's careful management, and Florence's garden expanded to include fruit trees and berry bushes. They added 2 rooms to the cabin as their family grew, and Blake built a proper barn to replace the smaller structure that had come with the property. Their cattle herd increased, and they began to sell beef to the growing settlements in the area. Silver Creek itself changed with the times. The railroad came through in 1860, bringing more settlers and greater prosperity. A proper school was built, where Thomas and Elizabeth eventually attended, riding their ponies the 5 miles into town each morning. Through it all, Blake and Florence's love deepened, tempered by shared joys and sorrows, the daily work of building a life together. They never forgot how their story began in a crude waystation on the prairie, with death hovering close and the future uncertain. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Blake surprised Florence with a journey. "We're going to Sacramento," he announced one evening after the children were asleep. "Mrs. Porter has agreed to stay with Thomas and Elizabeth. It's time you saw your aunt." Florence was speechless. They had corresponded with her aunt over the years, but the demands of the ranch and raising children had always made the journey seem impossible. "Blake, are you certain?" "It's so far, and the ranch, Jacob's son, is old enough to help out now, and he's agreed to check on things while we're gone," Blake assured her. "It's all arranged. You've given up so much, Florence, I want you to have this." The reunion with her aunt was joyous, filled with tears and laughter as Florence introduced the husband she had found under such unlikely circumstances. They spent 2 weeks in Sacramento, marveling at how the small settlement had grown into a bustling city in the years since the gold rush. "You could have had all this," her aunt said one afternoon as they walked through the busy streets. A life in the city, fine things. Florence shook her head, watching Blake ahead of them, pointing out something to a shopkeeper. I have everything I need, she replied simply. On their last night in Sacramento, they stayed in a fine hotel, a luxury they had never experienced together. Blake watched as Florence brushed her hair before the mirror, still as beautiful to him as she had been that day in the waystation, perhaps more so for the life they had shared. Any regrets? He asked softly. Florence set down her brush and turned to him. About what, any of it? Getting sick, being left behind, staying in Silver Creek instead of coming here to Sacramento. She crossed to him, taking his face in her hands. Blake Garrison, how can you ask me that? If I hadn't gotten sick, if you hadn't stayed, we might never have found each other. Everything that happened led us here, to this life we've built. She kissed him softly. The only thing I regret is that we won't have 100 years together. It doesn't seem like enough time. Blake pulled her close, breathing in the scent of her hair. Then we'll just have to make the most of every day we have. And they did. They returned to Silver Creek and their ranch, to their children and the life they had carved from the wilderness. More children came, twins Robert and James in 1864, and finally little Rose in 1866. A surprise blessing when Florence was nearly 40. The children grew, each finding their own path. Thomas inherited his father's way with horses and eventually took over much of the ranch's operation. Elizabeth, with her mother's head for figures, managed the business side. The twins, inseparable from birth, purchased adjoining plots of land when they came of age, expanding the family's holdings. Rose, the youngest, surprised them all by becoming a teacher in the Silver Creek School, educating a new generation of frontier children. Through the years, Blake and Florence watched their family grow, welcoming sons and daughters-in-law, then grandchildren. Their small ranch became the center of a sprawling family, a place where everyone gathered for holidays and celebrations. On their 40th wedding anniversary, with their hair now silver and their faces lined by sun and laughter, they sat once again on the porch of the cabin that had been their first home together. Did you ever imagine this? Florence asked, her hand in his as it had been countless times over the decades. That night when you decided to stay with me at the waystation, did you ever think we'd have all this? Blake looked out over the land they had tamed together, at the large family gathered in the yard, children, grandchildren, friends who had become family. No, he admitted. I just knew I couldn't leave you to face it alone. Everything after that was a gift I never expected. Florence leaned her head against his shoulder just as she had done so many times before. They left me behind when I fell ill, she said softly, and a cowboy stayed and fought the fever with me. Best thing that ever happened to me. Blake pressed a kiss to her silver hair. To us both, my love. To us both. As the sun set over their land, painting the sky in the same fiery colors they had watched together for 4 decades, Blake and Florence Garrison sat surrounded by the life they had built, a testament to the power of one decision, made in compassion, that had changed everything. The wagon train that had left Florence behind eventually reached Lone Pine, California, its passengers dispersing to seek their fortunes. Some found gold, others disappointment. But none, perhaps, found the true richness that Blake and Florence discovered in their simple life together, a love born in the darkest of circumstances that had flourished against all odds, growing stronger with each passing year. In the end, it wasn't gold or land or even prosperity that had made their lives rich. It was the choice to stay when others left, to fight when surrender would have been easier, to build something lasting from the broken pieces of their previous lives. And as they sat hand in hand, watching the next generation carry forward their legacy, they knew with absolute certainty that they wouldn't have changed a single moment of their journey.